In this piece that Mary John writes, which is titled Feminist Vocabularies in Time and Space, Perspectives from India, she talks about how we need to think more about intersecting conceptual histories that work simultaneously as much as sequentially, and also that we do not assume Western theories are only true in their Western locations and have to be somehow adapted at some later point to a non-Western context where they always suffer a lack of fit. And then she goes on to say in the segment next to that, that we should think about how concepts might have multiple contexts of origin and complex carriers of use and transformation. And given the power-laden relationship between places and people, we should think about the kind of work that concepts can actually do in their grip on the world. That should be the question that matters most. So in the light of these discussions, I would also like us to think, in relation to discussions over 5 days about how do these conceptual categories such as, say, radical feminism or socialist feminism or liberal feminism travel across both time and space, right? Like, so, we had these definitions of radical feminism, which we looked at in the earlier part, like Finn McKay's discussions, and also Michelin Vander, who we read in the first day. And I think one thing that comes across from both the definitions is this idea that there's a certain investment in a kind of dualist analysis of social structures along gender lines, and an investment in finding something that is called like a women's language or women's culture, right? In which the focus on the body and sexuality becomes very significant when we think about the history of radical feminism. So the question I think I'm trying to think about is that as we look backwards at feminist histories globally, how can we be attentive to the energies and afterlives of these kind of tumultuous phases, right? And how do vocabularies and idioms of these intervention interlink with other settings across different locations? So in the Indian context, at least as someone who's trained in literary studies and now teaching in gender studies, actually looking back when I was thinking of all my sort of study around the 80s and 90s, what came to me strongly is the discussion around women's writing in different regional contexts in India. And I'm sure many of you could add other contexts, but in Malayalam from Kerala, which is the context I'm also from, throughout the 1980s and 90s, there was a strong strain of discussion around what is called pennezhuthu, which translates as women's writing. So this idea that do women write differently? Is there a need for a new language? Not just thematic concerns, but also aesthetic questions around form, around language itself. Like, say, when a woman writes about labor pain, what would it mean to write about it in masculine terms? If the language itself genders the subject as masculine, could we talk about a specific feminine experience via that language or not, right? So there's a range of women writers at that time period, well-known writers like Sarah Joseph Gracie, who's debating this question about how do we invent, languages that are adequate to feminine experiences. And like Jay Devika writes, she says about Sarah Joseph conceived pennezhuthu as a most simple and direct intervention in everyday language to cleanse it of misogyny and invent terms that would be more expressive of women's experiences, right? Like, so at around the same time, you see in Telugu, which is the language of Telangana and Andhra, discussions around feminist poetry, right? So Volga in 1993 publishes this collection of edited poems called Neeli Mekhalu, Dark Clouds, which is an anthology of 92 poems written by 31 women feminist writers in Telugu. And most of the poems were written around incidents inspired from that time around women's issues. And so they're like, a lot of them are really powerful and hard hitting poems, which when we read them now, also they sort of stand as a witness to the voices of the feminist movement of this period. So if you take a look at some of the extracts I have, you have poems like, say, Vimala's poem Saundaryatmakata Himsa, which translates as aesthetic violence, where she says, where beauty is competitive, where beauty is commodity, let's hate beauty businesses. So you can see this kind of direct response to beauty pageants, particular discourses around commodification of women's bodies. Then this is another poem, Labor Room, which again is a longer poem. It's available online, but it's a poem that created a lot of controversy also because it pushed the language of realism, I think. Like, because if you just look at the opening of the poem itself, the moment you enter the labor room, you see Inferno in 3D, either hell on earth or the earth in hell, a river of pain on each table, hands, stifling screams, cries, calls, howls, yowls, throws, spasms, all normal, quite normal. And the poem goes on in this kind of strain. So there's a kind of, like theatricality in the staging, right? You feel you are in the scene of bodies, in all these convulsions. And the poem is actually titled Labor Room. So that's not a translation. So the term that, the whole question of what is language also comes up here, right? And the particularities of the experiences of women's bodies in that sense. This is again another well-known poem from this collection, which is titled Chupulu, Looks. I won't read the whole poem. You can read it for yourself. But it's really a poem about this woman experiencing these kind of looks, right? Like these needles, sharp stares, that are sort of striking her body all the time. All kinds of eyes that she feels are following her, hungry, like drooling dogs. They haunt my dreams in the dense jungle, on the road, in the bus, in the classroom. They chase my steps, tapping here and there, and the lastly, and so it sort of is this feeling of this woman who's watched all the time, right? Looks that can, take on like almost feral forms, right? Like, and become uncontrolled, become piercing, can hurt in that sense. And then this kind of turning back, right? Like, and so there's both movements in the poem. Towards the end, like, like it moves to, but the earth is mine too. I've taught my eyes to stare back, equally sharp, stares for stares. That is how I wage my war now. These cowardly stares that cannot look me in the eye flee to the underworld. How I long for the day when not only eyes, but the whole body of a woman bristles. So it's you can see that kind of language of, radical feminism sort of coming into different expressions of feminist writing in 80s, 90s, in different languages, right? And it continues in that sense. Like, in 2003, we have this major controversy around a group of women's writings in Tamil, which many of their poems, like it's 4 writers, Salma, Malati Maitri, Kutti Revati, and Sugirtha Rani, whose poems, when it was published in Tamil, got really widely attacked by the media and many commentators, critics, because again, about the explicit ways in which they brought in the women's bodily experiences, right? And many of their poems actually got translated, and it's published in this interesting anthology called Wild Girls, Wicked Words, which got published in 2012. And there's also this documentary film, She Right, that Anjali Montero and KP Jaishankar has made, which is available on YouTube if anybody's interested, which actually has interviews with all these women writers and talks about that time period and also their experiences of coming into poetry and what it means to write in particular ways. Yeah. It's stuck. Technology is not very okay. Yeah. So this is a quote from Kurti Revati's interview. I don't know if you can see it, but she talks about the publication of this anthology of hers called Breasts Mulegal, and why that collection was seen as something that was attacked, and like how the reception and the abuse she received after the publication of the anthology really made her think about, like, the kind of assumptions about women's bodies. And also because she's from the medical profession, right? Like, so she also says, like, as someone who's in the medical profession, how do we think about the socio-feminist politics of breasts as a woman? And then I realized the importance of me continuing my writing as a poet, exploring body politics and the role of women's sexuality in writing. So that kind of question that many of them are trying to address through the 80s to the 90s and today also, I think, about how do we write about the body in ways that also disturbs existing paradigms, right? Like, so if you, I hope you can see the poem. Like, it's a very interesting poem in that sense from the collection Mulegal, where she's discussing, sort of, okay, yeah. I don't know am I moving or something? No. Is it okay? Yeah. Yeah. Still. Is there a loose contact? Yeah. Yeah. I don't think the machines like the poem. Yeah. Oh, it's gone now. Yeah. Yeah. No. Be copied. Okay. It's coming. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, you must have gotten some time to read the poem, but it's really a poem that's also sort of trying to re-signify the breast, right? And also look at the way a woman is looking at her own body, right? Like, so if you look at it, it's a very, it's an inward kind of language, like breasts are bubbles rising from marshlands as they gently swelled and blossomed of due season of time's edge. I watched over them in amazement, right? So again, if you think about certain parts of women's bodies that have been historically sexualized, what would it mean for the woman to look at it herself, right? Like, so you're sort of, again, trying to intervene in that politics of the gaze, right? Like, and through the movements in the poem itself, there's a certain kind of way in which it's about the intimate relation one has with one's own body, right? Like, and what is that relation, right? Like, so it's a poem, I think, that's also trying to intervene in the histories of writing itself, right, around gender and the body. Right. The other collection of short stories that I'm sure many of you in the room would know, especially if you're from literature background, is the Spivak's collection titled Breast Stories. Right. Like, again, it's an interesting titling, right? Like, to 3 stories which are all very well known in translation and in their original, Draupadi, Breast Giver, and Behind the Bodies, which are all 3 different kinds of expressions of women protagonists and their relationship to bodies within very different economies of conflict, of labor, of advertising, of photography, right? Like, so it's an interesting question. How do we place bodies within these structures, right? And how do we think of forms of writing that can then respond and critically address some of these questions in very powerful and disturbing ways, right? Like, because again, it's interesting to think that these stories have had a long, there's so many iterations of them in other forms, so in other languages, but also on the stage, right? Like, so again, when I'm thinking about literature, I'm also not thinking of it as this contained zone. There's, in the Indian context, there's so many exchanges between women writers, activists, theater persons, filmmakers, right? Like, so these are like fields that are cross fertilizing each other to also give us a window to think about the energies of that time period, right? Like, yeah. So this, so I again would like to connect it to some of the debates which were happening in the 80s and 90s. And here, if you read this pamphlet from 1987, which is a pamphlet that Saheli puts out around anti-obscenity campaigns, the language of the pamphlet, I mean, it's a little far for you, but you can see that this whole discussion on obscenity, that the language of objectification, the actions they take, blackening posters, what is seen as, sort of offensive, right? Like, this kind of questioning of the placement of women as sex objects, right, as they call it. So the debate around objectification, and you can clearly see they're taking, there's a lot of, both the vocabularies of British and American feminist writings are being, are clearly making an impact in thinking about what is violent about cultural forms, right? And how do we respond to these forms of violence, especially in the 80s and 90s, when Indian media is also opening up, new forms of advertising, television, cable media, right, private media platforms entering into the, into the national scene, right? So it's also a shifting period, the late 80s, early 90s, where you get a heightened set of questions around how do we represent women's bodies, right? Like, yeah. And this is, again, an image I took from a feminist archive, which is, you can see it's a group of women like climbing on a ladder and blackening a poster, right? Like, it's an advertisement that they are trying to pull down or put tar on it. So this idea that, we reclaim the public sphere by removing offensive images, or, and again, the other protests that you see, which came up in Eileen's talk also on the first day, is the protest against the Miss World contest in 1996 in Bangalore, which was really a very heightened, massive kind of protest, especially around the swimsuit session, right, which they finally had to move to Seychelles. Yeah. So this idea of what can be shown, and this kind of anger around what is seen as a commodification of women's bodies, right? But again, these are like, I think as we discussed in the last session also, these are not static questions, right? Like the whole question around women's bodies, how do they get represented? And what is the relationship between sexuality and and freedom is a very negotiated question, right? Like, so somebody like Sohini Ghosh writing in 1999 in this essay, The Troubled Existence of Sex and Sexuality, Feminists Engage with Censorship, she talks about like the contradictions in the discourse of censorship and the dangers of appealing to the state for prohibition, right? And this is a danger that I think feminists have become more acutely aware over time. And there's the kind of, when we look back at the Miss World protest, you see this kind of troubling overlaps between feminist, autonomous feminist group protests, and like say this image you see here is a it's a Swadeshi Jagran Manch image, right? Like, so there are both right-wing groups and Aidva left-wing groups protesting around the same platform, right? And what do we do with that kind of heightened anxiety around, and the respectability, honor kind of discourses that can easily fall into, right? Like, and those are the questions I think that Shohini asks in this essay. But these are questions that women's groups also ask over periods of time, right? Like, so by the time in 2004, we have the same women's group, Saheli, put out, India newsletters talk about how we need to be, think about our modes of activism and move ourselves away from prohibition or censorship, right? So these are, like, I think, contested questions that shift over time. And there are many ways in which feminist protests in India, in that sense, complicate these trajectories of gender and bodies in public, right? Like, because again, I think there's so many different regional variations also within the Indian context, where the whole question of what would it mean to appear in public seem dramatically different also. And different women's organizations have deployed women's bodies in drastically different ways, right? I think one of the most well remembered protests is the protest in Imphal in 2004, where, which I think already people talked about, right? Like, where a group of women protested, Meitei women protested against violence by the armed forces, sexual violence by the armed forces, by staging themselves, disrobing and staging their bodies, right? With banners that said Indian Army rape us. And so, like Deepthi Misri, Papuri Bora, many scholars have written about the kind of, what does it mean to stage bodies in this fashion, right? And what are these strategies of protest that draw on the body, right? And try to sort of invert some of these assumptions about how women's bodies can appear in public, but do that in order to respond to systemic forms of violence, right? And in this particular protest, there's been a lot of important discussions about how literary forms then connect with theatrical forms, and then might have resonances with activist modalities, right? Like, so, the ending of Mahashweta Devi's short story Draupadi, where Draupadi refuses to clothe herself, right? Like, which is, I think, one of the most quoted and, known endings of a story in Indian language, because again, like, this power of this woman who's unarmed, but she's terrifying presence, right? Because, she refuses to discipline her body in that sense, or bear that marker of shame, right? Like, so what do we do with that moment in that story, right? And that, I think, in the context of the performance of Draupadi by, Savitri Haisnam's performance in the in Kanellal's play, has also, brought into attention these questions, right? Again, about women's bodies, performances, staging, and how then when the actual, the 2004 protests happened, people were also interlinking these kind of strategies of protesting, right? Like, so resistance in different forms, right? Like, and how do we then, and why do women's bodies and questions of clothing, unclothing, exposure, staging the body, how do they become so central to all these different sites, right? Yeah. And this whole question of performing bodies in public have been, there are many many moments that we can think of, many significant events where this question comes up, right? Like I think one of the, again, high points was the debate around the ban on bar dancing, right? Like which happened in Maharashtra in 2005. And there was a whole spate of activism around that. And this figure of the bar dancer suddenly became this political figure, right? Like, and what is the history of bar dancing? How does it connect with histories of caste, of gender, of sexuality, of erotic labor in the Indian context? And who has been historically the public women in the Indian context, right? Which we cannot think of those questions without addressing questions of class and caste, right? Like, so I think that bar dancers ban and the many kind of debates that came up after that also allowed for some of these sharp discussions to emerge around gender, labor, sexuality, and public performance, right? And the idea that also for different women, appearing in public have very different connotations or very different value at stake, right? Like, so because certain women have been historically rendered public and certain women have been, placed more as protected bodies, so that inner, outer, private, public, and the body question in India cannot be sort of addressed without thinking of all these kind of interlinkages, right? Like, so if you look at work around performance histories in the Indian context, like Lata's Singh's work on Raising the Curtain, or Shailaja Paik's new book on the vulgarity of caste, we could think about how both historians and anthropological work have engaged with these questions very differently, right? But I think one question that comes to the fore is that we cannot understand the sort of meanings of performing and performing women without taking into account these very differential ways in which vulgarity, obscenity, respectability have been attached to different bodies in India, right? So we see that actually in the last 10 to 20 years, right, there have been multiple protests actually which have tried to stage bodies in public, right? Like, so if you, I mean, as most of you would know, because these are more recent protests, right? Like the Happy to Bleed campaigns, or the Pink Cheddi campaign in 2009, the Besharmi Morcha marches, like, which is the equivalent of the slut walk campaigns, which we saw in different parts of India in 2011-12, right? These are a series of protests that have tried to use bodily exposure and shamelessness as a strategy of protest, right? But again, these modalities of protest have also been troubled, right? Like, because many scholars have asked about what might be the limits of such a politics of visibility in a context where some bodies are always already hyper visible, right? So how do we address that problematic, and how do we think about both artistic and activist practices that can take into account these technologies and practice of vision that have been very connected to these different hierarchies of gender, race, caste, right? Like, so I mean, I don't know if I think we're okay on time, right? Yeah, in spite of the late beginnings, yeah. So this article by Dolores, I find it a useful one because, because she actually raises this question of how do we think about women's writing or women's cinema beyond the question of, just sort of fixating on who is writing or who is acting, right? Who is directing? And she says that, I'll just read it out from here. She says, I've suggested that the emphasis must be shifted away from the artist behind the camera, the gaze, or the text as origin and determination of meaning, towards the wider public sphere of cinema as a social technology. We must develop our understanding of cinema's implication in other modes of cultural representation and its possibilities of both production and counter-production of social vision. I go on, as a form of political critique or cultural politics through the specific consciousness that women have developed to analyze the subject's relations to socio-historical reality. Feminism has not only invented new strategies or created new texts, but more importantly, it has conceived a new social subject, women as speakers, writers, readers, spectators, users and makers of cultural forms, shapers of cultural processes. The project of women's cinema, therefore, is no longer that of destroying or disrupting man-centered vision by representing its blind spots, its gaps, or its repressed. The effort and challenges now are how to effect another vision, to construct other objects and subjects of vision, and to formulate the conditions of representability of another social subject, which I think is an interesting, and a very ambitious, a way of thinking about what is the labor of feminist creative work, right? Like, and I think it's a question that continues to come back, right? Like, because it's not this whole link between feminist politics and aesthetics and what it means to object to objectification, right, as Ellen was putting it, and how do we look back but also look at oneself and reconfigure the subject differently, and this might happen only at these intersections also between different media forms, right, these, and between cultural forms and activist practices also. So to keep those connections alive is also, one important strategy that we have seen, which also allows us to think about the critical role of readers, spectators, researchers, teachers, a whole array of people that we can think of. So this is a recent production that I saw last year. It played in Delhi last year, but it was performed in 2023 in Bangalore, which is this interesting play like called Project Darling, which is about this group of young people getting together to sort of uh, go in search of this history of theater and women performers in Karnataka, and this kind of, marking the culmination of the initiative, Sharanya employed the findings into directing an experimental play in 2023, directed Project Darling. The piece reintroduces the bold and iconic Kannaveli Chenni, who once ruled the Kannada stage with her slapstick comedy and along the way smashed by patriarchy one joke at a time. So it's a really, it also uses humor, the archive, the absent performer, and also what histories get written out, right? And what would it mean to retrieve it? I was hoping if we had time, I think I can show you a clip of, on YouTube they have the link, but I don't know if the link will work. I don't think it's. Nope. Is there a way we can? Maybe I can just share the link with you. That might be easier. Yeah. So we are almost, we have half an hour. So I wanted to show you all this short film, and so that we can have an interactive session around that. This is a really interesting animation film by this filmmaker Geetanjali Rao called Printed Rainbow. So it will take you to a different, sort of zone. But let's watch it and, we can come back. Let's see. I don't think. Just pull it up. Sessions we can like have like maybe 5-10 minutes for discussions and then quickly come back. Yeah. So you could go ahead. Yeah. If you're quietly sitting, you can talk about anything. Anything about the film or in connection to the earlier discussions. I Today the technology was misbehaving.
I think that port which you are put to the HDMI, it's
loose connection
കാരണം മേഡത്തിന്റെ ആ ഫോട്ടോ വെച്ച് യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്ന വീഡിയോ യൂസ് ചെയ്തിട്ട് അങ്ങനെ അനങ്ങുന്നില്ല. ഇതെനിക്കൊന്ന് ലൂസാണ്.
We could have just used her port only. Anyway, tomorrow Malayika also has a presentation. Hers is also a Mac, but let her copy it in advance. Mac using ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടായിരിക്കില്ലേ?
ഒന്ന് കോപ്പി ചെയ്ത് വെച്ചിട്ട് പിന്നെ വേറെ ആരെങ്കിലും ഒരു ലാപ്ടോപ്പ് മേടിപ്പിച്ചു. എന്നും മേഡത്തിന്റെ തന്നെ ലാപ്ടോപ്പ് മേടിക്കുന്നത് സ്റ്റുഡൻസിന്റെ ആരെങ്കിലും ഒരു ലാപ്ടോപ്പ്.
And then we'll get one of the students to get the
സ്റ്റുഡൻസിന്റെ ഒരു ലാപ്ടോപ്പ്
So what is continuous to do or what is these are very colorful. What we discussed previously, and this is the national thing. She is listening about this. And she's got in this domesticity. Even this becomes a just can you imagine that and this sinner become like a
Yeah, but then it becomes almost so because for her it's such a contract.
she does like
It is so personal. And what do you think about this? How this is the position that I don't think that is good to anybody that I'm having a good time. That if you accept my joy as my possibility of carrying on, I don't really and okay, right, there is some sense of melancholy there also in terms of the monotony of the city and how different window differently but he is because I'm interested. He is like, and a lot of people are sort of in that vibe also. Like they're doing the same task or for her. So there's a relationship. But how the role of fringes in a one skyscrapers and also also the question of age and true. But then that's what's interesting. We just speak about the layer, what we see and we see someone. We also having like holding joy, and pursuing joy. Yeah, true. Going back into come back to the group soon. Shall we? What's happening here? Shall we go back to the bigger group? Volunteers are not joining. That's not very kidding.
I think there's been some, we are also getting late, right? So I can hear a lot of conversation. So I'm glad that, it's at least woken up people. So yeah, can we hear from some of you? Like, I think it's mainly 3 groups, right? So maybe each group, one person can, or 2 people, whatever. I talked a lot to this group, so maybe you all can start. Yeah, I clearly have lots to say.
Yeah, so we were primarily discussing we began the conversation discussing the significance of the matchboxes. Why it is only the matchbox. Of course, in India, we know that matchboxes come with different colored labels and all sort of pictures on them. And, so why matchboxes? It could be that for her, the character, the protagonist in this video, all these visualizations are like matches burning themselves out. So they'll only live for so long before something like a doorbell, which is, of course, you can see it in a from a modernist critique as well, that it's a doorbell is a call that calls you back to the present, and the sad present, the colorless present. So yeah, it's something just wakes her up, and it's only fleeting, and in that fleeting experience of being able to visualize that, she's come. And of course, and the window, the motif of the window, as everything is seen through the window, and of course it's colorless, it's deadbeat and not very interesting, and eyes are not able to see so much that she has to close her eyes to even, and that's when imagination happens. The imagination only happens at the cusp of the limited possibilities of the reality, and that's one thing. If you want to say anything.
Yeah, we were also talking about that if we don't really see it from feminist perspective also, there are so many layers, from black and white to colorful. The only matchboxes over the whole film is one thing that is colorful, and another thing we started with, that there is no sort of agency that women have to have something, or this is the real a woman is living by her own. This is a thing, there is a far more, this is something utopic for Indian society, that a woman living by her own, doing her own course, doing her own works, being able to relax, like a leisure for women is unthinkable for Indian households also. And do you want to?
But I believe that is not taking away from the feminist perspective. It is the feminist perspective as portrayed in the film. And also another point we spoke about was the loneliness of old age. So that mundane, monotonous life of the same dishes, the same clothes in the drawer, and that same routine life. So how that switch between a dream and reality just makes her feel alive, those visions.
And very small things, very small details. When she drives the truck, she overpasses the other trucks which were driven by men. These small details I liked I like this whole animated film. This is very thought-provoking.
Yeah, I mean, actually, there's not too many animation filmmakers recently they have come, but Gitanjali Rao's been doing it, for a long time, and I mean, she's one of the few Indian women animation filmmakers who have a longer, span. So again, it's an interesting question, like why animation? What does that do, right? Like, how is it different from a more realist form, right? Like, and what is she doing with the form, right? Like, and I think it's also because, it's also referencing other forms, right? Painting or, so you also think about these histories, right? And like you're saying, what do we usually see, right? Like, do we, what does it mean for us as spectators also to just watch a woman? It's not a state, it's not like she's necessarily posing it as a smashing patriarchy mode, but it is because within that context, within context we are familiar for what she does seem, there is a certain movement in that, right? Like, so how do we, and that I think is in, if you contrast it to some of the poems we were looking at, like Chupulu and all that, what work do they do, and what is something, and how can we interlink them, right? Like, I don't think they're, like you're saying, this is a feminist statement too, but you're doing it in a different form, right? And there, I think questions of humor, experimenting with different forms become interesting, right? Like the cat, for example. Yeah. There is.
So I was also able to observe this thing, like just like Anuprabha said, ki her real life was like it is shown in black and white, but whenever she is dreaming of what kind of a life she actually wants, it is in color. Also, the music changes. The real life music is very monotonous, slow, like how an old lady is supposed to be. But when she is dreaming, when she is in the window in her own world, it's like she is going places. Her real life is very confined, a very restricted movement she is doing in her own house, feeding the cat and everything. But whenever means she is like breaking borders and covering larger margins, like the whole river, then the thing, and she's going into the harems and everything. So it's like it's very unthinkable of means not only from the age perspective, but also there are real life restrictions in many ways, psychological or material, that don't always allow these things to happen very easily. Also, we were discussing ki why the matchboxes were put in a say secret space. So I think it is like an metaphor ki how that life is not that easily available. You will have, it is like somewhere hidden. We'll have like a corner in our mind where we think about these things, but we know it is not that easily put on the table ki ha that is something we can do. That was.
But you had something to say, no? Okay, yeah. Go ahead. No? Okay, yeah, go.
So we were also discussing about Sultana's dream and how the palace and the women sitting together and having a good time, drinking, bathing. It reminded us of that, and also this act of dreaming and of seeking joy and of who can dream and who's allowed to dream and how can they dream, and so then in effect, whose reality is it? And I think as spectators, we were also transported to this space where we were also thinking, is this happening or not happening, or is this real or not real? So it's also an invitation to us that whose reality is it?
And also the work of the imagination, no? I think that's an interesting question to think about, no? Feminism and its creative possibilities, how, what Noose calls like world making, right? Like you are actually creating worlds by entering into this, not just by making cinema, but also by watching cinema sometimes, right? Like how that also gives you some, like you're saying, joy or possibilities of imagination, right? Like just,
And
yeah. Go ahead.
I forget. Oh, and we also saying about how the ways in which the lady was traveling. So it was very sort of visibly, it was very masculine in that sense, like the fact that she was sitting in front of the lake, the way she was sitting and the way she was just traveling in the truck and all of that. And even I could find some gender connotations with the cat also, like just the way the cat would give like a stare, or just it felt like a man to me. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a masculine. It can be anybody, like some sort of soft masculine, I think.
It's also, I mean, because the question of age kept coming up, I think it's also interesting to think about perception, no? Like, especially in the Indian context, this idea that aging automatically sort of means constrainment, no? But then she's the one who's always on the move, right? Like, so how do we tally that, right? Like, so like you were saying that, no? Like, if you look at her from the outside, she also seems like she's leading a very mundane life, but she, there's so many possibilities within that. Yeah.
And also, I feel that the old man depicted in the animated film, he's not depicted as a patriarchal man. Like, they have their own spaces. He lives in a different building. Sometimes he checks up on her, and they share their matchboxes. I think it's a symbol for memory or whatever it is. Like, they are sharing these things, and they are like two matchboxes each, so it shows a bit of equality or such. And he doesn't, forces himself upon her, and also when she dies or just goes on the matchbox, he waves at her and he's happy, like he's not imposing himself upon her.
That's an interesting thought. Yeah, we'll give some space to the last group and we'll wrap up there because I think we're running late. Yeah.
were also discussing the palace scene and how she imagines this all women spaces, right? Even the courtesans, they're singing, but they're all women, and even the bathing scene, and she follows this woman. So that's very interesting. She looks on with curiosity. And you want to talk about anything else?
No, I mean, we were just also talking about the music and how it's very specific to the scene that is being depicted. So Farida Khanum is being invoked in the courtesan scene, and then Ichakdana Bichakdana at the end. So it's really specific to the scene itself. And yeah, women's spaces again as radical feminism. So
that's again the question that comes up. No, like these, most of her dream spaces are actually shared spaces where women are actually enjoying themselves or desiring each other or being with each other, right? Like,
Something I would like to add, Satyajit Ray's movie, that is Pather Pachali, the way Durga dances in rain and the way she, this protagonist, this old woman, she travels in the forest, it seems almost similar to me, because over there Durga is enjoying in the rain, open rain, and after that she dies. But what if Durga what if Durga lived and continued to live in the Thakuran lived, and would it be the story of Opu, or would it be the story of Durga in the city? So it came as a thought to me.
It's an interesting question, like, because, like if you think about a lot of the masterpieces of Indian cinema, it's often the male protagonist who gets followed, right? And leaves us thinking, like, Pather Panchali being a great example. So I think, is there a last word? Last comment. Okay.
Also, there are some comments, beautiful comments from online.
Why don't
students.
you, bring that in like 2 minutes, maybe?
So, like Indu is saying, the elephant and palace matchbox sequences reminded me of Sultana's Dream by Rokeya Begum, and the film made by Isabel Harguera titled the same. And Himalika is also thinking the same way about the Sultana's Dream. Then Hemjyoti also saying that I love the juxtaposition of love, labor and leisure in the film. Indu saying the images of saturated body in the palace sequence is striking because that has opened up a different kind of a world for her. And the Hemjyoti also saying that the women as the feminist spectator, participant, she's lying that concept. And the juxtaposition of color and black and white animated frames for the matchbox dreams and present life respectively, that was interesting.
Okay, thanks. I think that question of feminist as spectator is something we can keep in mind. No, thanks, Neeraj. And the last word we can have from you.
Just the form itself.
Oops. Is it not on? You could take this. You could take this.
No, I was just talking about the form itself, being using animation or the camera versus theater. So theater, I mean, this is not a criticism of theater or anything, but like camera is able to kind of focus onto what you want the spectator to see, right? Like it's like the camera being a medium to just focus our attention on one specific thing, whereas when you're like in a proscenium and you're on stage, you're able to see different aspects and you can't really control that. So just how this particular film also.
No, I think those are questions we can carry forward, right? Like, because the camera, again, there's so many critiques of the camera and what it does but what does the stage do? What are the possibilities these different forms offers? But thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for a great discussion.
I just want to add last comment. Like I like this concept that in many films people use kids as the protagonists to show various kind of wild imagination. But in this film we are seeing that old lady and old like men, they are the main protagonist, and they are living the life in their own way, and also they are going to different worlds in their imagination. So we can see that many times we put a limit to different age groups, but can we do that? Why can't in our films and movies or in theater even we can see that the people from different ages can have similar kind of imagination? So that is also very beautifully depicted in this film.
True. That's a good note to end on. I think we'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.